Hello, everyone. It's good to have you here. Please enjoy the lunch and the lemonade and everything while you speak here. We want to have a rather free discussion, since Joanna could talk about anything about education. So please feel free to engage and raise your hands if you have any questions, since I can see we have mostly students here who are the engine of education. So we want to have a rather engaging discussion. We will discuss the issues and problems of education, but to balance it, we don't want it to have too depressing or negative. So we will also show the bright side and some solutions, or the ideal education, what we imagine would be ideal. But before we start any discussion about education, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce you because I assumed that everyone knows you. I'm sorry, Joanna Williams. She's an MCC fellow right here, so you could actually see her very often here. Let's just get into. So before we discuss anything about education, I think it's very important to point out and to define the role of education, because in the progressive side, they often neglect the purpose of education, and they say it's not to transmit any knowledge, it's not to conserve anything. So what do you think? What is the role of education?
So I think education plays a vital role in society in relation to generations and in relation to inculcating younger generations, children, into the adult world. So I would follow the views of people like Hannah Arendt and Michael Oakeshott, who really argued that education is a relationship between generations where we're passing on to younger people their intellectual inheritance or their intellectual birthright. So this very much puts us in the domain of knowledge, of subject knowledge, of passing on. Again, I would put myself in line with the English poet Matthew Arnold, who talked about passing on to children the best that's been thought and said. So I think a crucial role for the teacher is in judgment of teachers deciding what is the best that's been thought and said. What is it that we want young people to know? What is it that the next generation needs to know? What the best that's been thought and said from the past that we can conserve in the minds of the younger generation. And I think that's what's completely missing nowadays.
And one of the arguments nowadays is that why do we need knowledge when everything is so quickly changing and there are new jobs every day and new professions, and who knows what we will need to know in a few decades. So what is still the validation of knowledge when there is the argument for skills and to know how to learn? How can we compare the two, or do they exist without each other? What do you think?
No, that's a really good question. And this is something which has been raised again and again. What does knowledge actually mean? And children don't need to know knowledge because knowledge is always changing. And I think that argument really began to become much more enhanced about 10, 15 years ago with smartphones and the internet becoming ubiquitous. And people would say, well, if somebody's carrying around with them in their pocket something that they can use and in 10 seconds find out everything they need to know, then why should schools be playing this role in relation to transmitting knowledge? But to me, that is a very ignorant thing to say, and it really confuses knowledge and information, because Google can give you information, it can give you facts, but what it can't do is tell you why those facts are important, why that information is important, how one fact remains, it has a relationship to another fact. And it can't do the thing I was speaking about in relation to Matthew Arnold of exercising judgment. It can't tell you which facts are more important or even more truthful than other facts. So you could Google and you could find out dates and facts and information, but they'll just be random snippets of information, useful only for participating in a quiz, you know, unless you've actually got some knowledge to relate all those facts and all that information to each other. The argument that's used as well is that there's no point teaching children knowledge because the jobs that we're preparing them for haven't even been invented yet. The jobs that children will be doing in 20 years' time have not been discovered. But for me, that's an argument which is possibly true, although I think it's often exaggerated. And when I look around today, you know, most of the jobs that I see people doing today did exist when I was a child. You know, doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers, hairdressers, builders, plumbers, electricians. You know, certainly all those jobs existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. All those jobs existed. So I think that argument is overstated. But also, I think, to me, it is actually a very, very good argument for teaching knowledge, for teaching children subjects, because in 50 years' time, maybe the skills that we're learning today using computers might be outdated, but actually knowing about the history of the world, knowing great literature, that won't be out of date. That still will be important. Having that legacy of the past, that intellectual knowledge, that will never go out of date. So to me, that argument about the world changing so quickly means it's even more important to teach children knowledge in schools.
That's a very interesting argument. I've never heard being skills to become outdated. So that's something to write down. And what do you think, just for one question, let me go to another direction, because they even say that the new generation will figure out what are the new professions they want to do later. So it's not that they will become or they will just happen to exist, but they will figure out for themselves. And it happens with the artificial intelligence. So just for one question, what do you think? Does it change what we think about knowledge and to acquire knowledge? Does it change with the emerge of artificial intelligence?
No, again, it's another good question. I mean, I'm very skeptical about artificial intelligence. I think it can be a really useful tool, and I'm sure there are some very important purposes that artificial intelligence can serve. But again, I think it's human judgment that is vital to tell you whether what you're getting from artificial intelligence is actually intelligent or not. So you could be given, say, 5 different texts in answer to a particular question if you cue that into an artificial intelligence generator. But it's only human judgment that can tell you which one is actually the best or worthwhile or even particularly relevant. We need people and people's brains to be able to make sense and actually pass judgment on artificial intelligence. And the only way you can do that, the only way you can exercise that judgment is actually to have knowledge yourself. The idea of artificial intelligence passing judgment on artificial intelligence just takes us into this kind of dangerous spiral, I think, and we lose the human input into this at our peril.
And that leads to the next topic, because you talk about people and deciding what's worthwhile to know and what's better or what's more important to know. But who is to decide what to learn? Maybe that's the million-dollar question. Who can decide what needs to be learned and what's valuable?
Yeah, I think this is why, for me, it's very, very important that teachers are subject experts. And again, it's something which has been, I think, very sadly degraded in the UK, in British schools. And I remember when I began my career as a secondary school teacher, and I remember overhearing very senior members of staff in the school I was working saying, well, if you're a good teacher, you could teach any subject at all. You know, and there would be some kind of joking almost, or a bit of bravado or showing off. So I was working in the English department, I was teaching literature, but hearing teachers say, well, you know, if I had a couple of hours, I could go and teach maths or go and teach physics. And the argument is that if they're only a couple of hours or a couple of chapters ahead of the pupils in the textbook or just given an evening to read up, that the skills of being a teacher are much, much more important than actually what the teacher knows, that the knowledge you're imparting is not as important as actually having kind of pedagogical skills, knowing how to make children engage in activities or ask questions. But it actually filled me with horror to hear those teachers say that, because I think the subject knowledge that the teachers have is the most important thing, because the decision about what pedagogical strategies to use comes entirely from the subject matter. It's thinking about the children, but also thinking about the subject that you want to teach. That tells you the best way to teach that subject and tells you what to teach and enables you to make decisions about what is the best. Why is, for English children, for example, teaching Shakespeare more important than teaching J.K. Rowling, which is not to knock J.K. Rowling. I'm a big fan of J.K. Rowling. But, you wouldn't necessarily run a literature course for 16-year-olds teaching just Harry Potter books. And it's a value judgment. It is a value judgment. I am being elitist, academically elitist. I'm arguing that there is more important knowledge to be gained from reading a Shakespeare play than from reading a Harry Potter novel. But again, the teachers who say, oh, well, you can just teach any subject, it doesn't matter, they would be the same people who would be arguing that actually teaching Harry Potter is important, because they'd be saying, oh, it's just about the vocabulary, it's just about sentence structure, it's just about the skills of grammar or the skills of writing a novel. Whereas I think in Shakespeare, it's not skills that you're getting, but it's actually something very fundamental about what it means to be human, which you're not getting from a Harry Potter story.
Before we move on and I choose what to pick out, I want to remind again the audience that we want it to be an interactive discussion. So please, if you have any questions related to what we said, you will have time in the very end, but feel free to ask. So just a comment or let's go on with the reading, because I see some people here being very involved in reading, and you argue for Shakespeare. In Hungary, we have we have readings in every year of the school where students need to read the exact book which we had to read and my parents and their grandparents had to read. And they sometimes argue that it's a very difficult reading and it's not for these generations and they can't really understand. But what I also say sometimes that it's very important for children to get to learn and love reading. So what do you think? Is there a balance? And as an elitist, you admitted we can argue about this. What should the children read at school, and what should be passed to them in order to learn about the culture, but also to love reading?
Well, I think the crucial words that you said in that question there were in school. And I think we need to see the classroom as being a special place. I mean, almost, dare I say it, almost akin to a church with a certain degree of reverence for the knowledge and what it is that we're discussing. So I have 3 children. I think having my children read, for me, that was like the best bit of being a mum, to actually be able to read them stories, to get them to learn how to read, to teach them how to read. That was something that I have absolutely loved. And certainly, when they're 3, 4 years old, I'm not pulling out Shakespeare and sitting there, or even any books that are kind of 100 years old. We're just looking at what's fun and what's nice to share. And that is something which is the home environment. It is just about how to spark a real joy and an enthusiasm and a pleasure in reading. But having said that, I'm sure all of you might experience this. Maybe you experience this as children. Maybe later you come on to experience it as parents. There is actually something really special, I think, as a parent, to be able to read to your children when they're kind of 3, 4, 5 years old, the same books that you did have read to you as a child. and to see that they love those books too. And it creates a real connection between the generations. And particularly if you go back to books that my own parents perhaps read to me when I was a child, and I then read to my children. And I think all books, but literature as well especially, can play that really important role in providing a point of reference that we share between different generations. So when my daughter talks to me, for example, about things that she's seen on TikTok or YouTube or influencers, or even, I'm embarrassed to admit, lots of kind of modern day pop music, you know, I don't really have a clue what she's on about, and I'll kind of smile and, yeah, okay. But when she talks to me about books that she's read, and the books that I've read too, and maybe even books that my own mother read, then it does create this real point of reference where we can all talk about the same characters and we all know what we're talking about. And I think that's a very, very important thing. But in the school, I think there is a place for saying, you know, hopefully, certainly by the time you're a teenager, you can read, you have experienced reading for pleasure, you have an enthusiasm for literature, and now we're going to challenge you. And we are going to give you things to read that are a bit more difficult, that are perhaps older, that are more complex, and that may not be as immediately as accessible. And again, I think that's the mistake that a lot of teachers in the UK make. This word that we get all the time it goes back to what you were saying about skills. The word is relevance. You know, if something's not immediately relevant to a child's life, then it's not worth bothering about. They'll obviously find it boring. But I think most things are boring, actually, boring and difficult when you first experience them. But the teacher's job, I think, is to take what might be seen as being boring and irrelevant and difficult and actually almost coerce or, again, this is a loaded word, I know, but almost manipulate children into enjoying it at first and show them themselves, or almost seduce them or manipulate them to show them that, yes, you might think that this is boring and irrelevant and not worth bothering about, too old, but that's your job as a teacher, is to show them why it is important and beautiful and worth reading.
We can agree on that, so you convinced me. But then you emphasized the role of the family and their parents, of course. So let's go into some more difficult topics than reading. Because when you write about the activism in schools, you mention a lot of examples of families being excluded of the decisions, or when parents can't really interfere or influence what is happening at the classroom. So before we go into these problems, let's see, where is the difference, or how can we divide the tasks of families and schools, and should we divide or should they cooperate, or what's your solution for families and schools to work together?
Yeah, these are huge issues. I don't know to what extent people follow the news in the UK, but these are huge, huge issues in the news in the UK right now, and they are changing almost on a daily basis. So it was just, not even this time last week, it was just last Thursday that we had new guidance issued in the UK for teaching sex education to children. Because there was a perception that it had really got out of hand, the range of topics that were being taught, the detail that was being gone into, and the undermining of parents' rights, and stopping parents from knowing what it was that children were actually being taught in the classroom. There's been concern about this building for a number of years, and the Prime Minister, I'm pleased to say, although I suspect it might be too little and too late, has really tried to row back on some of this stuff. But just to give you an example of how bad things had got in the UK, and then, you know, we can think about how we can change this. But one of the topics that's covered in the specific subject of sex education, relationships and sex education, is about gender and gender identity. And many of the ways that schools have been working up until now have been almost encouraging children to question their gender identity. So again, as you know, as a mother to a long time ago now, but what were young children, when you send your child off to school aged 4, you know, they don't know much when they're 4. But most children at the age of 4, you know, they know their name, they know whether they are a boy or a girl, you know, and that's one thing that 4-year-olds do know. And you don't expect within a few weeks of your child starting school for them to not know that information, to start questioning, well, maybe I'm not a boy or maybe I'm not a girl. And just simply even by posing the question, teachers of 4-year-olds have been putting those doubts in children's minds and making them question whether that is the truth, the facts or not. And then children are being taught that really you have a biological sex, but you also have a gender identity. That's something separate that's in your brain, and that your gender identity is actually more important than the sex of your body in determining who you are. And then they are told that, you know, they can almost choose which pronouns they want to use in school. They can have a different name. They could use the toilets of the opposite sex, the changing rooms of the opposite sex, and wear the school uniform associated with the opposite sex. And I think what I find most terrifying about all of this is not just that it happens, but that it's been possible for all of this to happen without parents knowing at all that any of this has happened. So there's been some reports in British newspapers of parents saying, well, I only discovered that my daughter was identifying as a boy, was being using a boy's name, using he, him pronouns at school when I went to parents' evening. And then I looked over and I saw on the register that the teachers had been referring to my daughter as a boy. And the schools have been able to do this without telling the parents. And the reason why this happens without the parents knowing is that the parents themselves are considered to be almost a risk to their own children, that the parents might not agree, but the parents might ask questions, the parents might not be happy with it. And if you believe that the true gender identity is within someone's head, and that what they say they are is a statement of fact, is a statement of truth, and the parents might question it, then that becomes a threat to the child's true identity. So it's almost as if the teachers see that in order to protect the child, they need to keep secrets from the parents. And to me, this is a very, very dangerous thing that speaks to a horrible situation in the relationship between teachers and parents. I think the ideal is that teachers and parents have quite clearly demarcated responsibilities. The teacher has subject expertise, has knowledge, has pedagogical knowledge. The teacher is in charge of education. And the parents, their expertise is in the child. You know, parents are experts in their own children, and it's an expertise which is driven by love for their child, which doesn't mean to say, you know, I'm not kind of hopelessly romantic. You know, I know from my own experiences, parents are sometimes working in very difficult circumstances. You know, parents sometimes make mistakes. But the important thing is that it's a relationship which may not be perfect, but is based upon love for that child, whereas what schools are offering is something very, very different. Ideally, you'd have parents and teachers working together in certain aspects, but it should never be the case that teachers are looking to protect children from their own parents and keep information from the parents like that.
In Hungary, it has changed a lot as well in the past decades. And I remember when we were at the school and students, when we did something wrong, it was expected for us to carry it on and to make it right. And the parents and the teachers worked together, and they tried to educate us and tell us what's right. And now, as you might also notice, or you can see at the schools, that now they are the enemies, the parents and the teachers, and they both declared for the child, but I can see that it's also to protect themselves. The parent want to protect themselves from. It might not be scientifically proved, but a lot of responsibilities are put onto the schools. So now we expect the teachers and the school to take care of the child from 8 to 4 or even longer because parents want to work. And all the education, which is over subject education, is required from the teachers. So how to behave, how to communicate, how to socialize, and how to eat with cutlery properly. It's all put onto the teachers nowadays. And the parents expect also that they can just pick up the kid and they will know everything. I don't want to go too far. So,
but just to come back to that, because I think definitely the same things and the same trends are happening in the UK as well. Exactly as you're saying about cutlery, and even in the news in the UK now, you can guarantee every single September when children start school, there'll be very shocking reports of teachers saying children are starting school not knowing how to use the toilet, starting school still wearing nappies. Now, you know, that is shocking. I think I think sometimes it's a bit exaggerated, but if it's true, then it is bad, and parents are not fulfilling their responsibilities. But I think it almost becomes a vicious circle, because the more schools do, by stepping into the parent role, not just that, but the more they do, and at the same time, the more they dress these things up as being something that you need to have expert knowledge in order to be able to do, the more they send out the message that parents are just not quite up to it, you know, that parents are a bit lazy or a bit not having the expert knowledge you need, and could actually damage the children. I mean, I don't know if it's a kind of Freudian thing that is in every country in the world, but in Britain today, for parents of very young children, you know, there are lots of reports on websites, parenting websites, you know, that if you potty train or train your child to use the toilet in the wrong way, you know, you could do them some really bad psychological harm, and this trauma, this psychological harm, that could be with them for the rest of their lives. So it makes it seem as if something which, I mean, clearly everybody here, you know, knows how to use the toilet, something that parents have been doing for hundreds of years, teaching children how to go to the toilet, suddenly becomes this very, 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 very complicated thing. And not just complicated, but like the consequences of doing it wrong are like, the stakes are raised really high. So on the one hand, I do agree, you know, this is bad. Parents should step up, take responsibility, teach their children how to use a knife and fork, teach their children how to go to the toilet. But at the same time, the more that teachers step in and do these roles, I think then it actually makes it easier for parents to say, well, okay, in case I get this wrong, or in case I don't do it the right way, then, you know, we should let the schools do it. And I think it becomes a very double thing. You know, who's to blame here? Are teachers doing more because they don't trust the parents, or are they doing more because they think the parents are just not doing it?
Yeah, parents are shifting their responsibility, but then they don't trust the teachers doing it right as well. And with the COVID and with parents seeing what's happening at the classroom, because they could see through the computer and they could listen while their child was having classes, they realized that there is something happening which they don't really like. But in the beginning, they preferred not to have those responsibilities. So could this trust be restored? What do you think? Let's focus on the bright side now. If there is any solution to restore the balance and the trust.
But no, just to come back to the point you're making at the end there, because I think that's really important. I mean, things like, sorry to be very basic about this, but things like using the toilet, eating with a knife and fork. I think the thing about those particular issues is that at very least everybody agrees that they are important. Reading, using the toilet, eating with a knife and fork. There is a consensus in society, parents and teachers. The argument is about who should be doing it, whose responsibility is it, but at least there is a consensus that these things are important. I think the problem is when it comes to teaching about gender identity, for example, or teaching about relationships, or teaching more moral and political issues, there isn't that consensus, and often you can have very big differences between the view of the school and the view of home. So, to give an example, which is a little bit old now, but in terms of a major event that happened in the UK in the past decade was Brexit. I'm sure you've all heard of this thing. Now, we know, obviously, that the majority of people in the UK voted to leave the EU, but among teachers, among university lecturers, this was much more of a minority thing. Far fewer proportion of teachers and lecturers voted to leave the EU. It was much more of a working class movement, whereas the middle class were much more likely to vote to remain. But what you had then in universities and in schools was teachers really imposing their own ideas then on the children, of making jokes about people who voted for Brexit being backward, stupid, ignorant. And you've got children then sitting in the classroom thinking, including my children, well, that was my mum, that's what she voted. Are you saying my mum is stupid and ignorant and backward? And it's that kind of divide where there isn't the consensus, but the teachers try to impose their own views. Then I think is when we get much more into indoctrination rather than education. And I think that's also where the breach of trust comes in. I think when parents send their children to school, they expect that there will be values that come from the school. So when I was a child, when I was a child, I went to a Catholic school, and clearly there was a very clear set of values associated with it being a Catholic school. But the fact was my parents had chosen that school. They agreed with the Catholic values, and they actually wanted me to have an education in those Catholic values. I think what's very different nowadays is I send my daughter off to school, and I don't agree that she should be taught that she could be a boy if she likes wearing trousers and enjoys playing football. I don't want her to be taught that. I didn't choose that. I didn't send her to school on that basis, and yet that's what happens. And I think that's where the breach of trust comes. So I think to restore trust, we need a much closer definition, a much more, a clearer definition of what the roles and responsibilities of parents and teachers are, and we need to get politics out of the classroom.
Do you think it's a national thing, or is it more closer to any schools in Hungary? It's not really a question whether we can choose where to take our kids to schools. We have free school choosing. It's rather a question in the West. So if you want to know what's happening at the school and there is a clear definition, is it a national thing? Is it more international, and all the nations in the EU, for example, should have the same rules, or what do you think?
I think having choice for parents is an important thing. So like I said, my parents chose for me to go to a Catholic school, and I think those choices are important for individual families. But I think particularly at the level of the nation, there is also an important role that schools can play in teaching children what it means to be British or what it means to be Hungarian, and providing a common sense of national identity. I think that's a very, very important thing. And you can tell it's important because the EU tries to undermine it. So the EU obviously sees that this is a threat to a sense of common European identity, the idea that national identity might be an important thing conveyed through schools. So the EU is coming up with policies in relation to citizenship education in particular and history education, where they want children across the whole of the EU to be taught common values about citizenship and a common sense of history, which, you know, I think there is lots of positive things there. I think we could point to European values, we could point to common ideas about European citizenship, but I think where it becomes a problem is when it overrides that sense of national identity and national citizenship too, which I think the EU would be quite happy to override the national and instead have people sign up to common EU values.
And that goes back to my question earlier, who is to decide what to teach? And you also mentioned that teachers should be subject experts. So where to put the authority and to decision? Because if we give more authority to teachers on the subject, let's say, then it's for them to decide what's happening in the curriculum and during the year. In Hungary, we have a national curriculum, so in every school which is under that curriculum, the same should be taught at every school. But then there is not that big of authority for teachers, or not that flexible, so they can decide when or what to teach. But with everything we were talking about, we also expect teachers to be autonomous on deciding what and when to teach. So where is the fine line? Or
no, these are very difficult questions, good questions, but very, very difficult questions. I mean, I would just say, perhaps just as a cheap comment, I think the very, very worst people to decide what children should be taught are bureaucrats who are based in Brussels. I don't think it's the role of somebody sitting in an office in Brussels who probably has had quite little to do with education in countries, in all the different quarters of the EU, to be deciding what every single child should be taught. But I think there are some very, very interesting tensions in what you're describing. And certainly for me, when I was a school teacher, we've had the national curriculum as well in the UK now, probably for about 4 decades. So all the time that I was teaching, there was a national curriculum. But even more than that, what children are taught is shaped by our national exam system. So we have tests for children at the age of 13, and then they do more formal exams in different subjects, age 16 and age 18. And what you find is that even if the national curriculum was scrapped tomorrow, children would probably still learn pretty much the same everywhere because teachers are preparing them for these public examinations. So that tends to form the basis of the syllabus. But to go back to my own experience as a teacher, I have to say I did find it quite frustrating being told all the time what to teach. But the point I found it most frustrating and actually led to me stopping being a teacher was when the school I was working in also decided to tell us how we should teach. They said, at the beginning you need to do 5 minutes warm-up activity, and then you need to do 20 minutes for this and 20 minutes for that. And at that point I thought, well, if you're going to tell me what to teach and you're going to tell me how to teach, I could just be a robot. There's nothing, very little of me that I'm bringing to this situation. It's not an interaction, it's just me following instructions. And that really led to me leaving being a school teacher. I guess what I would like to see happen is, I think a national curriculum is important. Like I say, I think it's important to create these points of commonality between children, between generations, and have a sense of what it means to belong to a nation through education. But I think the more we could actually involve teachers in that conversation about what should be in a national curriculum, and the more to which the national curriculum can reflect a canon of thought, again, going back to this idea I was saying at the beginning about the best that is thought and said, the more teachers themselves can be involved through universities, through subject departments, through magazines and now websites, and actually feeding into and actively engaged in that conversation, I think the better. You know, I made a cheap joke about bureaucrats in Brussels, but at the same time, I would almost say the same about civil servants in Westminster, in London. You know, I think they should be listening to teachers, engaging with teachers, and asking teachers, as you are the subject experts, what do you think should be on this national curriculum? And actually having almost a national conversation between the subject experts to create the curriculum.
I don't want to give you any hard times, but just let me be very honest. So you are saying that we should engage teachers even more. But on the other hand, we are also saying that teachers are becoming activists, and we can't really trust teachers giving all the knowledge which we expect them to do. So again, I see a problem here that if we give more responsibilities to the teachers of deciding what to teach, then it will become, again, a problem that it will be not the knowledge and the best what has ever said, and the quote which you're always saying. So again, I can't see how it could work. If we give
no, again, it's difficult. I think the problem is, again, certainly in the UK, and I'm sorry to always be speaking from a British perspective, and I'd really love to hear how these things play out in Hungary, but we've had kind of generations of problems now, for generations where teachers have not been seen as subject experts. I mean, I remember going, even for my interview to be my first job as a teacher, and I can't remember the exact wording of the question, but it was just something along the lines of, why do you want to be a teacher? And I said, but I really love English and I loved literature and I really want to pass on my love of literature to children. And I could see from the faces of the people who were interviewing me that that was the wrong answer. You know, I knew that was the wrong answer. It wasn't what they wanted to hear. And I'm thinking, I knew this, and I'm thinking, well, I need this job, I need the money, I need to pay my mortgage. And I knew full well the right answer was, well, I'm very child-centred. I think it's really important to listen to the children, and I want to be a teacher because I love children, and not say that you love the subject. Now, this was over 25 years ago, and over the course of 25 years, you know, this has just got worse. And I think the reason why we have teachers as activists and teachers who, so not every teacher, I hasten to add, not every teacher sees themselves in this way, but I think the reason why the curriculum lends itself to politics and teachers lend themselves to being activists is because education's been hollowed out of any other sense of purpose. So when you stand up, it's quite scary. I don't know how many people here have done it yet, but if you stand up, there's a few things actually which I think are more scary than standing up in front of a class of 16-year-olds, 30, 16-year-olds who are probably bigger than you, a lot of them, and, you know, 90% of them probably don't want to be there, and they'd rather be talking to their friend or smoking or, you know, just not at school at all. And you have to stand there in front of these 30, 16-year-olds and persuade them not just to sit down and be quiet, but actually to listen to you and to learn what you are about to teach them. And that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And it's also, as I say, quite a scary thing to do sometimes. But the reason why you can do it, even if you're only in your early 20s, even if you're smaller than all of these pupils, is because of the authority that you have as a teacher. You're in charge and you have to summon up that authority and impose that authority in the classroom. And where that authority comes from is the question. You know, what is it? You need that. You can't do that at all if you don't have authority. So the question is, where does this authority come from? Now, I think it should come from your subject knowledge. It should be you saying, well, I know, whatever you know about sex, drugs, music, TikTok, you know, you probably know more than me about all of those things, and that's great. But I know more than you about English, and you're here to learn English. So this is where my authority comes from, to teach you English. The problem is if you can't say that, if you don't feel able to say that, then you need to find another source for your authority. So I think teachers reach to politics and reach to activism almost as if that is a different source of authority, of moral authority, when they can't turn to their subject knowledge. So I think what I was saying about the jokes about Brexit, for example, or lessons in gender identity that are kept from the parents, is it's almost as if these things then give the teacher a sense of not just moral authority, but moral superiority. And we did have this very, very much in Britain around the whole debate about Brexit. I'm better than you because I voted to remain in the EU. I'm better than you because I know the names of all the 73 different types of genders. I'm better than you because I've got a badge that says my pronouns. So it's when you haven't got the authority that comes from subject knowledge that you look to politics and to get a different source of authority in the classroom. So I think it's important that we get it the right way round. You know, what happened first? I don't think these teachers have such great political ideas that they become activists because their ideas have won. You know, I think their ideas are really quite bad, but I think it's because we've taken knowledge out of education first, so you create this vacuum. You know, if you're going to corral 16-year-olds into a classroom, you have to do something with them. You know, you have to tell them something. You have to have some source of authority and something to convey. And if you haven't got knowledge, if you take knowledge out and you create this sense of, well, here's all these 16-year-olds, do something with them, have some authority, impose yourself upon them, that's when people are reaching for politics. So I think, you know, we need to not just get the politics out, almost that's a byproduct of getting knowledge back in, I think is the first thing.
And if there is enough knowledge, then there is no place for anything else, which is not supposed to be there. Let me point out, I'm also for the teachers, and I believe that there are great teachers, so I'm just provoking you, but I also believe that in Hungary, I think it's still very rare that teachers replace knowledge with activism and political beliefs. But still there are problems, and I'm sure that all of you experienced that you had a bad teacher for any reasons, because it wasn't engaging how they were teaching, or the knowledge they were giving it wasn't what you expected, you felt it's not that useful. But there is a problem with teachers in all around the world. So what do you think is the solution? Can we somehow manage it with the present teachers who are already in the system? Can we do something with the activists? Can we somehow restore the value of knowledge? Or is it the task of the new teacher training and the students who are learning to be teachers?
I have to say, I think it is mainly new teachers now that we'd be looking to. I think it would be a new generation of teachers coming in. But that doesn't mean to say that you just give up on existing teachers. I think when you have a cultural shift and a dynamic coming into schools, I think in the UK there are a very small proportion of teachers who genuinely want to be seen as political activists. I think it's more just, as I say, like almost by default of not having any other sense of purpose. You know, giving children lessons in the importance of net zero and carbon neutral and protecting the environment becomes a much more tempting thing to do when you can't give them lessons in subject knowledge. But I think if you were to say to these teachers, actually, it's okay to remember why you loved your subject. You know, I think if I was in charge of schools in the UK, what I would do is I would send all teachers, you know, I would have more teachers, and I would cut the time that existing teachers spend in the classroom in front of children. And so I would free them up then, so they've got kind of 1 day a week, equivalent of 1 day a week, where they're not actually teaching. But that wouldn't be a day to go home, and it wouldn't be a day to catch up on marking or anything like that. It would be a day to go back to the university or go to the library, and a day to spend reminding yourself, what was it about your subject that you actually loved? What was it about your subject that initially excited you? Because nobody goes to university for 3 or 4 years to study a subject and then goes to learn how to be a teacher in that subject if they didn't at some point in the past have something that they loved about that particular subject. So I think it's important that we let teachers remember what that was and then give them permission almost to say, it is okay to say that you want to be a teacher because you loved that subject and you want to pass it on. You don't just have to have that. So I felt when I came out to that job interview 25 years ago and I said, I lied, I said yes, I read what they wanted me to say, and I said, oh, and I love children, and I do, it wasn't a complete lie, but I said, yes, I think being child-centred is really, that's the most important thing. So phew, great, tick the box, great, you can have the job. So I came out of that experience thinking, I've got to pretend that I don't really like my subject. I've got to pretend that I'm not here because I love teaching literature. This has got to be almost like a guilty secret that I can only let the children know when the door's safely closed and no other teachers are walking past. And I think that was a very terrible thing to do to the young 23, 24-year-old me. But I think I was not alone. I think a lot of teachers have also kind of kept that feeling that, yes, there was at some point in the past something I loved about this subject, but now this is almost a guilty secret, and I've got to leave that love of the subject at the classroom door. And I think actually engaging teachers again with their subject and importantly giving them permission to say it's okay to be a teacher because you love your subject, and we can help you and teach you again how to impart that subject, and that's okay to do that. I think, but also I think, yeah, you're absolutely right, a very crucial role with the younger generations, and it's surprisingly how quickly, if you start with new teachers, how quickly the balance shifts towards those teachers then taking up the majority in the school, and then you have a shift in the culture overall.
Thank you. Now let me address the audience, because I see that lunch is starting, so some already is leaving. So please raise your hand if you want to ask anything. There is one question. Thank you, Dori.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen to how education and certain aspects of education could get to one very extreme, for example, with the extreme politicization of education. And my question would be connected to where do you see the balance? Because you argued against the politicization of education because you see one extreme. But my experience, I attended high school like 3 years ago, and I see that in Hungary sometimes there is another extreme. For example, when it comes to knowledge, I think knowledge plays a very important part in Hungarian education, and what I experience is that there is so much focus on the lexical knowledge that the children actually hate to learn, and they stop learning at the age of 18. Also, when it comes to politics, like politics is taboo in Hungarian schools. So if the teacher is not very brave, they don't even start to like make a fair argument or just give a concept, And so my question would be, do you think that either politics in school or like focus or like having where do you see the balance in either like politics in school or knowledge and skills? Where do you think the optimum should be placed? Thank you.
Yeah, no, good question. Thank you. A few things in relation to that. I think one of the things I've picked up on, and I'd be interested in people telling me if I've got this very wrong, because it's purely just an impression that I've picked up from speaking to people is that in Hungarian education, there can be quite a lot of rote learning. Classes can be quite dry. Knowledge is imparted in, almost dare I say it, quite a dull way sometimes, and that this turns children off learning. Again, I would argue that this is actually a lack of teacher subject knowledge rather than too much teacher subject knowledge, because maybe the word that I'm missing here is confidence. Because I know, again, from my own experience of teaching, when I very, very first started out, I knew a bit about my subject. I didn't really have much confidence in relation to what I actually knew. At that point, actually just saying to children, read this book, or just listen to me, even worse, just listen to me read this book to you, kind of becomes the easy option. Whereas when I really, really knew something, when I had very in-depth knowledge of the subject, that's when you can have fun. That's when you can play about with it, because you know it so well. You don't need to say, right, we're going to read this word for word. You can say, right, today we're going to act this out. You're going to do this and you're going to do this. And we are going to debate. You're going to argue this point of view. You're going to argue this point of view. And I think that's when you're getting knowledge, but it's in a much more engaging way than just kind of rote learning facts. Sorry, I've forgotten what I was going to say. Just very, very quick point about politics. I'm going to sound like a complete hypocrite now, because we've talked about the importance of getting politics out of the classroom, but I think I need to clarify that a little bit. I think that's most important for younger children. I think teachers, particularly for older children, I'm on about, I guess, from the age of 14 and above now, I don't think teachers should pretend that politics doesn't exist. They clearly live in the world, and children live in the world. And I think it would have been wrong for teachers at the time of the Brexit referendum in the UK, for example, to have just pretended that this was not happening, or to even pretend that they don't have a view on it. I think children will know. Every adult is voting in this, so what did you vote? And I think teachers can be asked that question and should be able to answer that question as well. I think what's important, though, and the line for me between education and indoctrination is when you say, and this is the only view, or and this is the right view, and all the other views are wrong, and I'm not going to tell you that this is just my opinion, but I'm going to say, but this is the right opinion. So I actually think, I would say really for under 13, under 14, you just easier, just keep politics out altogether. But from 14 onwards, I would say actually there is a place for bringing, in some subject areas obviously, in some subject areas there is a place for introducing children to the idea that views are contested, that even when we talk about truth, there's often different opinions about knowledge as well, particularly when it comes to literature. There are different ways of interpreting literature. There's not just one way, one truth when it comes to interpreting a text. But rather than imposing their own ideas and saying, and this is the correct way, of actually saying, well, some people think, and I think the best teachers are actually able to play devil's advocate, are able to argue just as much and just as convincingly the opposite to their own views as they are to argue their own views. So that at the end of the class, I think, and I'm pleased to say I've had students coming up and asking me at the end, well, what do you really think? Because they genuinely couldn't tell. Which is not to say you keep politics out altogether, but you should be able to just as convincingly and just as even-handedly, when you're engaged with a class where they all have their own opinions, say, well, what do you think and what do you think? And just to be even-handed in doing that the students are not clear what your own view is at the end of it, but you have engaged them in a political debate.
I think that's the key, what you're saying, to show both sides or even all the sides, and to be respectful with the others if they have different opinion, but you mentioned literature, and I think that's a great way to show what the word is out of the school. But just for a very short note, let us talk about the citizenship subject, because also you mentioned in the UK, but in Poland now they are replacing history and the present, the history subject with the citizenship class subject, and it's very dangerous when the bureaucrats you mentioned, who you want to leave out from deciding what to teach, are deciding what is the gist and the topic of the subject. So just briefly, what do you think of these subjects, which integrates politics actually with teaching democracy and all these?
I think this is another way in which politics comes in quite directly, and again, it's even as if the individual teacher's views don't count for anything, as if there's a kind of national sense of this is what you should be saying, this is the kind of officially approved view. I think I'd go for history over citizenship every single time, because citizenship is very much focused on the present, and I think, you know, there are some facts, there's some useful knowledge that children should know about how different parliamentary systems work, perhaps about how the electoral system works in particular countries. But when you start moving beyond that, you're essentially, again, creating what I was talking about earlier in relation to a vacuum in the classroom. Citizenship is a subject without a body of subject knowledge above and beyond, you know, we have elections every 4 years, and, you know, you can do that in half an hour if you're effective. So you put this subject on the timetable, and then there isn't a body of knowledge, there isn't an academic discipline, there isn't a historical tradition associated with that. So again, you create this problem of the moral authority of the teacher. You know, you're telling teachers, oh, you must teach children about climate change, about what it means to be a good citizen, about relationships. Even in the UK right now, we ditched, I'm pleased to say, some of the gender ideology, but what's come in to fill this gap, because if you create these lessons in a timetable and you don't have a body of knowledge, you create this vacuum. You have to have something there. So what replaced at the end of last week the gender ideology was friendship. But that seems to me really bizarre. You know, how do you teach 5- and 6-year-olds about friendship in a classroom? You know, how do you teach them about friendship in theory? I mean, to me, you know, the example I used was it would be like teaching children how to cook without letting them anywhere near food or an oven or a saucepan, you know, just doing it all as a theory. If you want to teach children about friendship, you let them go out into the playground and make friends and fall out and solve their differences and make friends again. You know, you can't do these things in theory, and citizenship becomes a bit like that. It just becomes this receptacle for anything that's currently fashionable, any cause or news story that seems to be vaguely fashionable can then get put on that part of the curriculum, and it's almost as if the teachers then have to get into politics because there's nowhere else to go.
Exactly. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. If we don't have any more questions, then we can close this. Thank you very much, Joanna, for this fruitful discussion, and I hope you could all take something from this discussion, and thank you for your attention and being here. Have a good afternoon.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.